All right, today we are going to finish up our unit, which is actually a beginning of chapter 16, the lymphatic system. We are not going to cover this immunity here. We're basically going to cover just lymphatic vessels and how they filter fluid, which is called lymph, through lymph nodes and put that fluid back into our blood or back into arteries. Okay, this is an image that you should get familiar with and be able to understand the flow of interstitial fluid, which starts right here. Okay, interstitial fluid is fluid that is found outside of cells and outside of blood, and it sits right here. It's osmotic pressure that pushes against veins and arteries or arterioles and venules, which eventually can be filtered by lymphatic capillaries. So the first step is that lymphatic capillaries will take in this extra fluid. Once it takes it in, it's called lymph. It travels down a lymph then vessel to a lymph node. And tomorrow I've decided that I'm going to stop the notes today before we get to the structure of a lymph node. So we'll talk about this actually tomorrow, and we'll go over this and we'll talk about the parts of a lymph node. Once it leaves the lymph node, it goes back to another lymphatic vessel and enters a lymphatic trunk where it pools into a lymphatic duct and then back into, this is going to be our subclavian vein, which ultimately goes to the inferior vena cava back to the heart. We can think of this kind of as a pool. The function of a pool is that we need to filter the water. So we have these grates over here, which are going to take the excess water that flows out, and they're going to have to bring it to a filter and filter it out, get rid of the waste, and then somehow that water has to go back to the pool. And that's exactly what our lymphatic system does with our interstitial fluid. Again, once that fluid enters our lymphatic vessels, it is called lymph. So the function is that these lymphatic vessels are going to collect and carry away excess fluid between or in these interstitial spaces. So we had a question earlier, what is interstitial space? Interstitial space is just the space between cells. So there's fluid that exists there. Okay, your body is 90% water. This is filled with fluid called interstitial fluid, but the organs of the lymphatic system, again, we have the lymphatic capillaries, lymphatic vessels, lymph nodes, lymph ducts, and it sends everything back into our blood, and so we're actually filtering that fluid, okay? And so here we can see, this is kind of what we drew on the board. We've got our network of, here's our arterial, our artery going to our arterial, to our capillary bed, and this is where we're going to filter out, the fluid because our hydrostatic pressure is going to be greater. And then on the arterial or venule side, we're going to put that fluid back in. 90% of it is going to go back into the venule. Well, what happens to the 10%? The 10% remains in the interstitial space, which is between these cells that we see in the background, this pink, and it'll eventually be collected in a lymphatic capillary. Okay, once that fluid is picked up, the lymphatic system's job is to filter that blood. And there's a couple different cells that work in the lymph node to filter this fluid. There's a lot of things that exist in this fluid, and so the lymphatic system is running throughout your entire body, filtering fluid. You have to know the lymphatic pathway. So if we look here over on the right, I would write this image in your notebook. We started a lymphatic capillary that is found by our blood vessel capillaries. It's sent through a vessel called a lymphatic vessel to a lymph node, and this is where the main filter is going to take place. You can think of this as the filter of the pool. We then have to pump that fluid once it's been filtered through a lymphatic vessel into like a trunk where we can then collect it and pump it back into the pool or back into the blood through the subclavian vein. So we're going to start in lymphatic capillaries, and these are tiny closed-ended tubes. Okay, and these are kind of like, they look like hands in the picture, green hands in our picture. And they, through osmotic pressure again, are going to diffuse water in. Basically, they're diffusing water in. Some things that can come in with this water are bacteria, viruses, extra white blood cells, platelets, sodium, that sort of thing. And so this is collected in lymph capillaries. It forms a network, and this runs parallel to your blood capillaries, right next to them. And eventually this fluid will be pumped to a lymphatic vessel. Okay, they are made of a single layer of squamous epithelial cells, just like in your capillary. So right away, I think of a question on the test. Why is it a single layer? Why wouldn't we want this more than one cell thick? We'll go back to what its function or job is. It's to filter. And the only way to get this fluid in is through diffusion. And so a single layer makes it a lot easier to do that. The interstitial fluid, then, after it enters the capillaries, is going to be called lymph. It's no longer called interstitial fluid. Remember, interstitial literally means the fluid between cells. We're no longer between cells. We're in lymphatic vessels or capillaries, and so we call it lymph. Okay. Lymph is eventually going to be returned to the blood in the right and left subclavian veins. So up here and over here, that's where we're going to see our duct. You can see the image of this gentleman here. We have lots of lymphatic vessels running through our body, and you can see these little nodes, which look like little kidney bean shaped, are found around our elbow, in our armpits, and a lot in our groin area. So this is where our filtering or active filtering is going to be taking place. It'll then be pumped back up and into the subclavian veins, left and right. This is a close image of a lymph vessel. So we've already collected in the capillary. It's going to be pumped through the vessel, and we can see here a valve that exists. This arrow is pointing to the valve, okay? The walls are similar to veins, but they're a lot thinner, and they do have valves. These are semi-lunar valves, and this is going to prevent backflow. We're pumping it in a one direction. We want to pump it to a node next. So the movement of lymph is moved in by hydrostatic pressure. Okay, so the tissue fluid is going to drive the entry of lymph into the lymphatic capillaries. The hydrostatic pressure inside the vessel is going to drive that interstitial fluid in through the lymph or the lymphatic system. The force that move blood and veins also propel lymph through the lymphatic vessels. And again, there's those semi-lunar valves that are going to help move it in one direction. We want to get it from the interstitial space to a lymph node where we're going to actively filter it. You can go back to and look this up for the test if you want to remember these forces. We talked about these forces, about how they work in a capillary. It's the same forces that are going to work in lymphatic system. Okay, so we've got the two forces working there, force outside of the vessel and force inside the vessel, and that's going to move the interstitial fluid into the lymphatic system, and then we call it lymph. Here we have an image. We can see the subclavian vein right here, and you've got a network of these little nodes or lymph nodes in your armpit. Okay, there's a condition that exists that interferes with the flow of lymph, and a lot of times you can see edema or a mass of swelling or buildup of fluid, look like big tumors almost. It's called edema. This is a backflow or backup of lymph into tissues, and so the tissue swells, and actually when you see edema, you know that it's just basically interstitial fluid or water building up. One condition that we see this a lot is during surgery. If we're removing tissue and we disrupt lymphatic vessels or tissues or remove them, it's going to result in edema. One such thing is mastectomy. So that's why this image is here. Mastectomy is removal of breast tissue. So if you've known anyone that has breast cancer and had to have a mastectomy, a lot of times when we cut this tissue out, and knowing that cancer first probably travels to our lymph, so we want to get it to catch it right away so it doesn't travel to our lymph. And if it goes to our lymph, it can go into our blood and travel everywhere else. If we cut this tissue off, we're actually going to disrupt the flow of this lymph fluid, and we're going to have flowing back into this empty now cavity. We're going to have swelling called edema. The structure of a lymph node, we are going to stop right about here, but lymph nodes contain different types of cells called lymphocytes, which are macrophages. And you can think back to when we talked about a macrophage. You may have to look that up. These are particles or cells that are able to go through phagocytosis, which is just a process of eating and digesting foreign material. You can go, there's a video linked in Schoology that goes through phagocytosis, and these lymph nodes are all over the body. They kind of are concentrated in certain areas. Again, we said armpit, some of the elbow, groin are the most, okay? Because they go through what's called phagocytosis, these macrophages, they are able to digest foreign particles, or you probably can hear my dog scratching, or harmful material that's in the lymph or placed in the lymph's path. Okay. The structure is that they're bean-shaped. They're 2 to 3 millimeters, and it can get as large as 1 to 2 centimeters. If you've ever had a swollen lymph node, you know that we've got something going on. We've got some lymphocytes and macrophages that are building up that are trying to get rid of something. So that's a first sign that we are infection or illness or something's going on with the body. So if we ever have one of these inflamed and they're getting larger than 1 to 2 centimeters and they come up off the surface, we know that there's something going on there. We're going to stop here with notes, and I know I said I was going to do a bunch of slides, but we're going to stop here. We're going to do the structure of lymph nodes tomorrow, Friday, so I can do this with you in class. What you are going to do now is go to Schoology, and you're going to answer some questions about the notes that were just given to you. When you finish and complete these questions, please pick up a review if you have not already. You will be able to answer questions 1 through 21 on there. What you will not be able to answer is the back page. However, please look at the very last part of the back page because there are 2 little prompts or hints towards what the big essay questions are going to be on the test, which takes place Tuesday the 17th. One of them you probably already know, but look at them, start working on that review. I don't care if you work together, just don't be disruptful. I will see you on Friday where we will cover the structure of lymph nodes. We will maybe perhaps build one out of Play-Doh, and we'll get ready for the unit test. Please email me if you have any questions. Don't forget to answer the questions in Schoology.